Chapter 3. The boggart emerged from the underbrush. It peered left, then right, then straight ahead, and all the while a silver arrow remained trained on the centre of its bulbous, warty forehead. The dark little grotesque's goggling eyes didn't see the arrow, or the elf that held it taut against the string of a bow stained forest green. Rhys, Dane of the Hemlock Pack, saw the boggart clearly. Of course they would. The well-hidden elf stared fixedly down the length of his greenwood bow, beyond the razor-sharp arrowhead to the boggart's twisted, cunning leer. The vermin took a single careful step forward into the clearing. It sniffed the air through its broad, flapping nostrils. Rhys's hand was steady, but his instinctual disgust of the boggarts hovered over him like a cloud of stinging flies. They were vile things, mockeries of elf perfection that dared to take roughly the same shape as nature's blessed. Boggarts shared with elves the same number of arms and legs, but where elves were tall and lean and elegant, boggarts were squat, misshapen and clumsy. Elves had skin that ranged from alabaster to polished bronze, each shade completely unique. Boggarts only came in various shades of scab, from rusty red to dead crusty black. Male and female elves alike proudly wore thick curved horns that crowned their angular faces. The flat, squarish blockhead of the boggart was barely crowned with anything but diseased fungi and slimy moss. A boggart's feet, each a unique, hideous deformity, were disgusting compared to the slim, cloven hooves of a noble elf. And those, Rhys thought as he calmly drew another motionless breath, were only the physical differences. The general notion of what boggarts got up to in their dank, stinking little hovels disgusted him beyond expression, and so he refused to consider the particulars. Rhys continued to hold perfectly still, barely breathing, completely concealed by the foliage and a hint of glamour. The local boggarts had always been an ugly, unruly lot, but this particular band had inexplicably turned feral. They lived wild in the woods, and of late had been waylaying any undefended travellers they could find. They were dangerous, behaving much like the boggarts' ancient forefathers had in distant past, before elves like Rhys brought the peace and order to the forests of all of Lorwyn. Outrage simmered at the back of the Dane's mind, threatening to distract his aim. Wild boggarts from the foothills once plundered bountiful Kifkin caravans. Today the average lowland boggart, who found itself near a thriving, bustling town, would do no worse than skulk around its edges and corners, creeping and crawling to avoid notice. The most brazen might steal a pie from a kitchen window, or startle passing children by grabbing at their ankles from under a rock. Rhys exhaled evenly and kept his arrow unwaveringly fixed on the boggart below. This vile thing and its fellows were not like most lowland boggarts. This ragged horde had actually attacked one of the Kifkin villages, Kinsbale, weeks before. Kinsbale was far from the river and several days' hike from the nearest Kifkin town, but it was still elf territory, still subject to the authority of the gilt-leaf elves. When these boggarts went to Kinsbale, they didn't skulk or grab at ankles. They charged straight to the centre of town where the richest shops and most expensive homes were, raging and rioting like beasts. When they left, 2 of the fine houses had been burned to the ground, and one Kifkin family was missing, along with all of their belongings. These boggarts had tasted both blood and battle in their attack on Kinsbale, and had developed a liking for it. They were now drifting towards Dundoolin, the largest Kifkin village in the region after Kinsbale and one safely within elves' reach. There was no telling what the boggarts would do when they reached Dundoolin. It fell to Rhys to ensure they never got the chance. It did not matter one whit that Dundoolin had capable fighters, and was, in fact, very well defended. These boggarts were not simple vermin, but bandit raiders brazenly operating in elf country, and they must be treated as such. They had shown no mercy at the nation's tenants in Kinsbale, shown no fear or respect for the laws of the forest. Those laws had been set down by the elves long ago, and had been enforced for generations by dedicated packs of gilt-leaf hunters and rangers. These boggarts not only broke the blessed nation's law, they defiled the very ground beneath them. They were a living, breathing insult to the forest, to the nation itself, and it was Rhys's sacred duty to answer that insult with a stinging rebuke. Without the nation's strong, guiding hand, this blood-stained blighter and his feral cohorts would be the norm. Without the order and discipline that spread outwards from the gilt-leaf elves, Lorwyn's lesser tribes would quickly destroy each other, and then the land itself, before they finally destroyed themselves. Rhys's eyes continued to bore into the oblivious boggart's skull. The sharp corners of his thin lips turned up, and his eyes narrowed. Chastising this lot was his sacred duty, yes, but it was also his passion and his pleasure. He had trained all of his life for moments like this, mastering the sword and the bow and the trail so that when his nation demanded it, he could fight to preserve and expand its glory. Whenever he drew his sword, bent his bow, or worked his magic, he did so for his nation, for the gilt-leaf. He was a functioning part of the tribe, shouldering his share of the elves' burden on their blessed path to perfection. Rhys quieted his rising joy, sobering himself with the renewed revulsion he felt as the first boggart turned and beckoned others out of the brush. Beyond the glory of the nation, beyond his sacred duty to make bloodied examples of these bandits, Rhys longed to simply banish the grubby little creatures from sight. In every conceivable way, they disgusted him. The removal of these boggarts from the world would beautify Lorwyn in more ways than he could easily count. This was the way of things. Elves ruled Lorwyn, and boggarts stayed out of sight. Rhys and his pack would remind these boggarts of that fact, and in doing so remind every tribe why elves were their rightful masters. The boggart below was carrying a mercifully recognizable chunk of flesh and bone as he scuttled into the clearing. Rhys followed his motion, confident that a dozen elf archers positioned around the clearing had already individually targeted the rest of the horde. He would wait until all the boggarts had emerged from the brush, or until the clearing was full. His scouts had been unable to accurately gauge the size of the horde, and then Rhys would give the signal to fire. If his pack held to the standards he demanded, not a single boggart would survive the first volley. Any of the horde that managed to flee back into the woods or towards the river would be rounded up and driven back to the killing ground by his rangers. Any who managed to escape would quickly wish they hadn't. Rhys had every intention of containing this rabble and ending the boggarts' rampages once and for all, right here. To that end, he had taken extraordinary steps to ensure the success of this mission. His pack's discipline had been strained recently with the influx of raw recruits. They lacked the experience and composure Rhys demanded, but Sari Nath himself, the Gilt-Leaf's most feared and respected general, simply told Rhys that that was why they had been assigned to him, to gain much-needed experience and battle seasoning. A mere Dane like him could not object, but he was certainly not about to let these untried archers' rough edges jeopardize his reputation. He had retained the services of 2 non-elf specialists to back up his main force, an unorthodox move. But Rhys had learned firsthand that boggart hunts rarely go as planned, even under ideal circumstances. On this hunt, on this punitive mission, thinking the unthinkable and preparing for it could mean the difference between victory and disgrace. Rhys's ears twitched a moment before the boggart he'd targeted reacted to the tiniest cracking sound from the east. Rhys twisted his right ear towards the sound, but it was too late. The boggart started and dropped his grisly trophy. He craned his knobby neck and scanned the trees to the east. The Dane nearly swore out loud. The next few seconds would tell. When boggarts sensed they were being hunted, they shrieked to warn all nearby boggarts of the danger. Then they all fled, or attacked, together. The exact pitch of the shriek determined the outcome, and any elf that could not tell a shrieking charge from a screaming retreat would soon be a dead elf. There had been no shriek yet. The boggart was wary, perhaps, but not ready to sound an alert. To Rhys's relief, the boggart moved again. Rhys did not, and his ears told him the rest of the hunting pack hadn't either. They might still pull this off. Rhys followed the boggart, his fingers itching to loose the shot. Soon. Below, the first boggart reached the middle of the clearing. There were at least a score of his kin crawling and hopping behind him in plain sight, and thus in mortal danger from veteran elf archers. Veterans he didn't have. He supposed amateurs would have to do. Another few seconds. Rhys remained still, poised to let fly his envenomed arrow. His orders had been perfectly clear, and if his archers were up to snuff, each one would know his or her target. No arrows would cross in mid-flight, and every last boggart would receive a single lethal bolt and be dead before they hit the ground. The best archers chose first, primary targets selected by position, size, and apparent age. Secondary targets were for newer members of the pack, all within arrow range of the primaries. Tertiary targets were near those. With mathematical precision, the elves would knock the boggarts over like individual stalks of fresh wheat. It was more orderly death than things deserved, but they would still serve as an example Rhys wanted after he left their bodies along the edges of the gilt leaf. The first boggart relaxed slightly and dropped into a crouch. It had reclaimed its fleshy morsel and turned it around, making the torn flesh unfortunately more visible and recognizable to the waiting elves. Unable to restrain itself, the boggart snapped off a finger with nearly a full set of jagged yellow teeth. Another boggart scrambled into Rhys's field of vision, an old warhorse whose leathery body bore dozens of jagged scars beneath its mossy growths. It seemed a secondary target wanted to move up in rank, which would have been fine by Rhys if the first boggart hadn't been so obviously the leader. For any other elf to take down the first boggart would be improper, potentially even insulting. Rhys needed to make this kill. After that, so long as there was an arrow for every boggart, it did not matter what order they were received. Thinking too much again, Rhys told himself. He waited for the big, leathery boggart to hunker down and paw in the dirt. Then Rhys carefully settled the silver arrow tip so that it pointed between the ears of his original target. The pack was in place. In a moment, Rhys would drop his chin and whistle the attack command, the first and only command he needed to give. Twin waves of moonglove poisoned arrows would streak toward the scattered boggart tribe, and each one would find its target. In the time it took to blink, Rhys's projectile would slice through the air and strike the flesh-wielding boggart between the eyes. A single silver arrow flashed through the pack leader's field of vision, knifing through the brambles to disappear into its yelping target. From his angle, Rhys suspected the early arrow had come from a young Yelm, an apprentice huntsman promoted to Rhys's pack as a favour to the youth's mother. As Rhys had feared, Yelm was not ready. The untested elf had lost his nerve, and with a single errant twitch, the entire ambush had soured. It was understandable, inexplicable, yet completely unacceptable. The other archers, thinking they had somehow missed the command to fire, rushed to catch up. The panicked boggarts commenced babbling, and scrambled every which way once the first arrow hit, dissolving into a chaotic muddle that spoiled the aim and intent of the archers. Within seconds, the carefully choreographed wave of arrows Rhys had seen in his mind's eye became a slipshod barrage of poorly timed shots that, judging from the sounds of impact, missed as many targets as they struck. Rhys spat and dropped his chin, releasing his own arrow before the lead boggart could vanish into the chaos. His bolt hit home, and the boggart stumbled back, driving the arrowhead exposed from the back of his skull into the bark of a thick tree. Rhys felt a momentary twinge of sympathy. He had studied among Lorwyn's treefolk for nearly a third of his life, and injuring the tree was painful to him, and harmful to his spirit. Yet Rhys brushed aside such concerns. It was hardly pressing, nor was it the first time the elf had done such a thing in the course of battle. It certainly wouldn't be the last, and few would have spared as much sympathy as Rhys. Later he would carefully clean up the tree and wipe away the boggart's foul black blood. With the right spells and glamour, the tree would heal, and its bark would extend over the boggart's corpse like a shroud, securing the little monster in place, and hiding its repugnant form from sight. Any who passed by would know the tree had been marred for a good cause, without having to view the boggart's actual remains. A duty for another day. Rhys bolted from his position and sprinted down to the increasingly loud melee, roaring for his archers and rangers to advance into the clearing. The ambush had failed, but the bloodshed had just begun. He was still determined that these boggarts would never leave the clearing. The elf notched another arrow, sidestepping as the foam-flecked boggart charged at him. He slammed his elbow into the brute's ear as it passed, driving it face first into the loamy soil, from where it sent up a wet cloud of moss and dirt. Rhys straddled the boggart, bent his bow, and then pinned the boggart's head to the spongy earth. As he stooped to retrieve his arrow, a cacophony assaulted Rhys's sharp ears. The sound of boggart shrieking was everywhere, a distinctive cry that meant, "Attack the intruders!" Rhys was more outraged at the horde's audacity. Faced with a full elf pack, he expected only a shriek that said, "Run for your lives." The boggarts had chosen to stay and fight, and that meant that they would be at their most dangerous. If they had numbers on their side and could pack themselves tightly together, a boggart horde could give an elf pack real trouble. Boggart tactics, like these, were not meant to achieve victory, but to make their opponent's victory as costly as possible. The boggarts would swarm over and overwhelm as many of their foes as they could through sheer weight of numbers. Boggarts bred like rats. Even well-disciplined elves could only hold off such a swarm for so long. Rhys's pack materialized like ghosts from their camouflage among the trees. They fell upon the boggarts, gracefully slicing through them and slipping past them until the long, willowy bodies of the elves among the short, squat forms of the boggarts struck Rhys as a stand of cornstalks in a mushroom patch. The grisly sounds of close-quarters combat slowly overwhelmed the chaotic chorus of bowstrings. Rhys heard elves crying out in pain, as well as boggarts' wails, and he smelled the blood of his blessed pack members mingling with the noisome stench of boggart bile. He ought to let them fight it out, he thought, to let the boggarts have their due. That wasn't the experience Serene Nath had in mind, however, and Rhys knew it. He nodded grimly to himself. This was where his unthinkable backup plan came in. First he had to separate the elves from the boggarts. That would be simple enough, though his pack would be stung by the insult, perhaps rightfully so. Let them bear the insult, Rhys thought, rather than the scars of boggart teeth. He shouted out a command to withdraw. There was shock and disbelief on the faces of his hunters, but they responded quickly enough. Those who lingered did so only briefly, as they could see the arrow Rhys had notched. It was another arrow-grass shaft, but the arrowhead was unique, dull orange-brown in colour. It was a translucent wedge of highly polished resin that glowed softly from within, like a dying lantern. Even the rawest new recruits recognized what it was, and they knew to get well clear before Rhys let his arrow fly. Rhys aimed the hardened piece of yew sap at the centre of the boggart's unruly formation. Yew poison was as rare as it was deadly, and Rhys had been fortunate enough to be apprenticed to the only yew treefolk still alive. Amplified by yew sage magic, yew poison was even more formidable. The whispered words of a yew spell slipped past Rhys's tight lips as he let the arrow fly. All of his elves were out of harm's way, safely removed from the centre of the clearing. So that very moment the tip of the resin arrow touched the centre of the boggart's battle mound, Rhys shouted the incantation's final, sharp, percussive symbol. The crystalline arrowhead shattered against its target, releasing a cloud of glittering amber dust that surrounded the centre of the boggart horde. Smoke wafted from the larger pieces, spreading over the boggart's flesh like oil on water. As Rhys watched, every boggart that had glittering orange dust on its skin or in its lungs stopped breathing. As one, they let out a ragged, mournful sigh and dropped where they stood, deader than stones. The others fell into renewed panic. Rhys heard the run for your life shriek at last as the boggart formation disintegrated, and they all broke and ran, fleeing from Rhys, howling and stumbling over themselves as they made for the river. Rhys placed 2 fingers between his lips and whistled, the only signal that could cut through the din of the raging boggart retreat and carry across the forest to the cavernous ears of the elf's hired help. The reply to Rhys's signal was abrupt and impressive. If one valued strength over style, brute force over focused action, and the rock-solid durability of a club over the keenness and flexibility of a saber, the nearest of his hirelings, Brion, erupted from beneath the soft loam of a nearby hillock, and the boggart mob skidded to a horrified stop. They backpedaled, scratching and clawing at the ground and each other to stay outside stomping range. Towering over them, Brion flexed his massive fists, each large enough to hold 10 boggarts each. He positioned himself directly in the little brute's path and planted his feet. The bulk of the hillock remained atop Brion's head and shoulders like an earthly crown and cape. The decidedly unregal figure opened his mouth so wide his jaw nearly touched his belt. Then Brion roared. Rhys's sensitive ears tingled painfully, but the giant's bellow did far more damage than that. The sound bent all but the thickest of trees and sent a horizontal shower of oak leaves and pine needles whizzing across the clearing. Some of the boggarts were blown completely off their feet. Others rolled like misshapen hedgehogs. The hilltop crown crumbled, its thick, rich soil sliding away from its framework of tree roots and bramble thickets. It was still solid enough to lay hands on, however, and solid enough to throw, and Rhys's hired giant was not about to let that opportunity pass by. Brion dug his thick fingers into the underside of the makeshift mulch regalia, shifted his hips and shoulders, and heaved upwards, launching the crumbling remainder of the hilltop towards the boggarts. Those still standing scattered, and some of them even got clear. The rest, those who could not run or did not run quickly enough, let out a searing cacophony of wails and squeals as the giant's improvised avalanche descended. The impact shook the ground. Brian's triumphant leap shook the ground twice more, once as his feet left the forest floor, and again when they returned. The sound of trees falling was almost lost against Brian's delighted whooping, but Rhys heard several topple in the woods behind the giant. There was an eerie moment of calm as everyone recovered their balance at all their hearing, or assessed the state of their wounds. Rhys winced in distaste. Without the hilltop concealing his features, the giant's huge, lumpy face stood revealed. Where boggarts were obscenely ugly, giants were merely spectacularly repulsive. Fortunately, giants were not nearly as numerous or odious. Brian and his brother Kiel were the only giants Rhys had ever seen in the past 5 years, and it was his good fortune that they were looking for work. A boggart's shriek rang out, one thick with the fear of being crushed underfoot. Rhys also heard murmurs of surprise and sullen whispers from the elves in his pack. He tucked this detail away for later, when he was attending the pack's overall poor performance today. There were still scores of boggarts loose around the clearing. In the wake of Brian's greeting, They scurried out from their hiding places and made once more for the river. A few even crawled out of the great mound of soil and rocks the giant had thrown at them, limping, staggering, yet miraculously alive, until they were trampled by their fellows, swarming over the pile of bodies and dirt in a frenzied rush. Brian lifted both of his hideously calloused fists into the air and roared again. He bounded forward, rotating his long arms in wide circles. The giant brought his knuckles and the soles of his feet down on the remains of the hillock, smashing flat those boggarts still moving underneath. Still whooping joyfully, the giant lumbered after the fleeing boggarts, sweeping his arms through the rapidly thinning crowd like twin mallets. He scooped up handfuls of the shrieking creatures and brought his palms together in loud, wet, booming claps, over and over and over again. He scooped and clapped, until the rumbling echoed across the forest like thunder on a cloudless day. Rhys saw a trio of boggarts disappear over a ridge to the west, where he had stationed Keel, his second hired giant. Keel was out of sight, which was something of a blessing, but Rhys could clearly hear him going to work with the same enthusiasm as his brother Brian. Rhys listened to the sounds of carnage and shook his head angrily. This was not how things were meant to be. Killing boggarts en masse was supposed to be easy. There wasn't supposed to be a battle. The boggarts were supposed to be dead before they knew they were under attack. Melee with boggarts was degrading work, unfit for one of the blessed, but most certainly appropriate for giants. Griffith might well have been correct. However, with the political situation being what it was, it would have been better if Rhys and his elves had accomplished this unpleasant task themselves. In hiring the giants, he had chosen success of the mission over protocol, and that gave Naf solid justification for whatever punishment the Tarsain saw fit to impose. No one was allowed to question protocol, even if it meant failure of the mission. In Naf's eyes, giants were not fit to work alongside the blessed. Rhys didn't see how he could have chosen otherwise. He wasn't sure of his pack, and if his pack had failed on its own, they all would have been punished, blighted, or perhaps even killed. At least this way, Rhys alone bore responsibility. There was certainly honour in that, or so he told himself. So focused on his thoughts was Rhys that he was nearly struck by a flying boggart that soared down from the west, where Kiel's lowing roars continued to underscore his increasingly violent rampage. At the last moment, the elf deftly stepped aside and the boggart's flight ended with a thud at the base of a tree. Rhys shook his head again. The sooner this messy business ends, he thought, the sooner I can atone for it.